everyone, welcome to our podcast season specifically addressing sex education. My name is Carly Ritchie and you are listening to episode 1 of this series. Today I will be discussing sex education in the school curriculum and looking through a student's perspective to help inform others about this topic. So that being said, let's get started. So for everyone tuning in on today's episode, I want you all to think about your days in middle school through high school. And I want you to ask yourselves if you ever partook in a sex ed course during your time in school. Now, I've only been out of high school for 1 year, and I did partake in a sex ed course for my health class in 7th grade, but it was only for one class period. That being said, I think there could have been more time put into informing the students about sexual intercourse. Sexual intercourse in today's society is labeled as a norm, and I think that stems from the lack of knowledge and communication teens and students have about this. From research on this topic, I have uncovered that students are requesting for more information on this topic and health issues that arise from sexual intercourse in their health classes. It seems as though this topic is just breezed by and not talked about in depth regarding the prevention of STDs and AIDS. In addition, students are also wanting to know more about medical alternatives such as effective birth controls. These discussions could really be effective in our society and could prevent many uneased subconsciouses. Teens who are participating in sexual intercourse are at high risk for these negative side effects that could be life-changing and not in a good way. I found a blog titled Different Viewpoints, Sex Ed from College Students' Perspective, where a student actually talks about sex ed in her hometown and her perspective on it. And she basically emphasizes on how her school only taught their students about abstinence. She also comments on how the school did inform all the students about the negative side effects of sexual intercourse, but left out the alternatives if students were sexually active, such as condoms and contraceptives. Because of this, the student felt like the knowledge of the alternatives listed above would have benefited her fellow classmates by preventing unplanned pregnancies throughout the high school. The school also continued to leave out how to be safe when being sexually active. As a whole, they didn't even discuss how to talk about sex in general. They felt as if that should be left up to the parents to discuss with their own children, but that can sometimes backfire on the student in a sense that the student may feel embarrassed to talk about with their parents, or the parents lack in communication. Some kids grow up with parents who believe that talking about sex is just something you never bring up. I think kids rely on their parents to be completely honest with them, and being able to go to your parents and talking about sex could really benefit the student in a way that they know what their parents' expectations are, and just to be at ease knowing they can go talk to their parents about a touchy subject. In addition, the students not being informed about sex, whether that be through the school or through their parents, they may begin to fear the idea of eventually participating in sexual intercourse because of the lack of knowledge and communication they were receiving from their superiors. They're only told the scary stories and the horror of the side effects if they choose to have sex, but an effective way of simmering these thoughts would be if schools took the time to inform their students about all aspects that come along with sexual intercourse. After that, the child then could choose whether they wanted to have the same conversation with their parents. The idea of implementing sex ed courses in schools is just to inform kids about the risks they will be enduring if they choose to do so, and just to encourage them to think and plan ahead when they would really like to start a family and not just be thrown off by the idea if they do have an unplanned pregnancy. So that being said, let's talk about alternatives that could benefit the change in the way schools address sex ed courses. First, a bill could be passed implementing sex ed courses in the curriculum. I know each state is different, but for Kentucky specifically, they are trying to pass a bill to help prevent transmitted diseases and unplanned pregnancies. If the bill was to be passed, students would participate in this course, but the amount they were exposed to would be based off of their grade level. In addition, parents could review the curriculum and decide whether they would like their child to participate in this course overall. Secondly, the schools could encourage parents to begin talking with their kids about sex. This would be a great opportunity for parents and students to communicate about this topic without feeling embarrassed. This also allows for students to ask their parents any questions they may have. Thirdly, addressing birth control and condoms for teens would be a great alternative in decreasing the number of unplanned pregnancies and transmitted diseases. Students would feel a sense of ease knowing they are using protection when being sexually active. Lastly, getting your child checked out for physical examinations yearly would be a great stride in preventing transmitted diseases. Having them checked out is important because some may not notice they have it for months, maybe even years, and then one day they go in and give a urine sample at a doctor's office and soon after discovering they have an STD or HIV or AIDS. So keeping up with physical examinations just allows for an ease, conscious, and a better life. As a whole, all of these alternatives could be effective and should be taught in sex ed courses and not just left up to students to discover on their own. So, in ending this episode, I hope everyone listening will encourage their school to implement sex ed courses. I think if this course was part of the curriculum, students would feel as though they could make a sensible and logical decision about sex, and they would have a better understanding of what sexual encounters are and what comes along with it. That being said, thank you for tuning in on today's topic, and make sure to come back for episode 2.
Hello everyone, welcome back. Thanks for joining in on episode 3. My name is Liz, and I'm going to be talking about how teachers are affected by censorship in sex education. In Kentucky, sex education is not as progressive as it should be. Sex education is not required to be medically accurate in the state of Kentucky and 17 other states. Teaching about contraception is not required, so therefore abstinence is what gets taught. Even if the faculty or Board of Education want the students to learn accurate information about safe sex, they would be going against state law to teach it completely. Yes, you are allowed to teach about certain information that is accurate, but it isn't required, and you are not allowed to focus on anything but abstinence. Telling students to not have sex is not sex education. By teaching abstinence, it's only raising the number of teen pregnancies, STDs, and abortions, because students were not taught about consent, safe sex, or protection. Since sex education is rarely taught correctly in Kentucky, the quality of information being taught is not always good. The sex ed teachers are sometimes misinformed and not trained to teach sex education. If they were to have to focus on anything but abstinence, they would misinform the students. The less in depth they have to go with the conversation, the better. They're sometimes as clueless as the students because teachers don't need to meet certain requirements to teach sex education. The textbooks the teachers teach from are usually old and therefore usually always abstinence only. They're also free and more convenient for the school because the schools don't want to spend any money on sex education. Teachers will sometimes just wing it and say what they already know instead of teaching the students the information they need to know. They skip over the stuff that makes people uncomfortable. You can't teach sex education without making some people uncomfortable, or else you're not teaching it right. Sometimes guest speakers will come to teach sex ed, which can sometimes be a good thing if they're educated and not censored, but most are censored. The culture of the school or the wants of the teachers, faculty, or parents are the reason for a lot of the censorship outside of the abstinence-only education. Students will learn about sex, whether it is talked about with an educated adult or not, so it's better to have learned it from someone other than friends at school who are probably not educated on the topic. A professor at a school that teaches abstinence in Texas, David Wiley, says, quote, "The locals determine sex ed in about 99% of cases," end quote. He suggests that parents serve on school health advisory councils and in other local parent groups. Quote, "Quit wasting time lobbying your state representatives and senators. Volunteer. Serve on those committees. If sex ed is bad in your schools, it's because you haven't gotten involved at the local level," end quote. Teachers sometimes choose to only teach abstinence not because of their own beliefs, but because they're afraid of backlash from parents. Teachers sometimes need the support of the Board of Education and other faculty so they aren't alone in handling the important issues. Teachers play a very important role in sex education for young people. They're usually the first source of information about sex for students, so it's vital for them to give a sufficient amount of information. Darlene Shearer, assistant professor of public health at WKU, said that, quote, "Abstinence-only education in and of itself does not reduce the likelihood that a teenager is ever going to be sexually active," end quote. Teachers have to focus on abstinence only, but some do choose to touch on the topic of birth control options and how to obtain it and consent. A health teacher at Bowling Green High School, Julie Lane, discusses the reproductive systems, STDs, and teen pregnancy with the students. She talks about self-esteem and communication, important parts of sex education. Quote, If a student can communicate their limits and have decision-making skills, they're going to have better outcomes, we hope, end quote. She does focus on teaching abstinence while also addressing some questions about birth control. She thinks that teaching about the benefits of waiting to have sex is the better option for the age group because she's teaching freshmen. Amber Nugent, a home economics teacher at South Warren High School in Bowling Green, talks to her freshman students about abstinence and to her upperclassmen students about birth control and teen pregnancy. She gives the students interactive dolls to help them understand how difficult being a teen mom would be. Quote, "We talk about oral sex. We talk about it all," end quote. Since students are most worried about getting pregnant from sex, she shows them birthing videos to make them want to be abstinent on their own. Many teachers send home letters to parents about the information being taught to their kids. Quote, "A lot of teachers don't want to get involved in potential backlash from the community," said Gary English, head of the Department of Public Health at WKU. "That's why community members and educators should work together instead of stepping around the important issues. Schools are meant to give students important information we'll need for the rest of our lives. We may not absolutely need to learn algebra or astronomy, but what we do need to know is sex education. Teachers need to be trained enough to teach accurate information about sex ed, and they need to be comfortable with discussing the difficult topics." Thanks for listening and on today's topic, and make sure to come back for episode 4.
Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for tuning into our episode. We will now be tuning into episode 5, in which we will be discussing sex education teaching content being censored in the classroom. My name is Joshua Jordan, and today I will talk about censorship in sex education, which has many stakeholders such as sex education and teaching content in the classroom. Content is the information that teachers teach and what students are expected to learn. We all know that school teaching content is for the advancement of our minds. The things that we teach and preach holds the key to the future of our young children. We demand for high-quality teaching content. Learning materials/content are important because they support student learning. The content in which that they take advantage of help decision-making in which will impact them on an everyday basis. Teaching comprehensive sex education includes human sexuality, human sexual anatomy, sexual activity, sexual reproduction, age of consent, reproductive health, reproductive rights, safe sex, birth control, and sexual abstinence. Not all schools and states have this type of learning place in sex education classes. Learning sexual content was and still is considered taboo in certain schools and areas. Adolescents and cultures were kept quiet of information on sexual content traditionally. Most of your true experience would be given from your parents and would often be muted because of their own traditional beliefs. The change in demand for a progressive change in the teaching of sex was due to increased pregnancies in the 1960s. The backlash of this new movement was from opposition of parents and religious groups. With the outbreak of AIDS, it helped the school's decision to input this controversial topic to develop a sense of urgency. Sex education is looked by scientists as a way of providing health and care of our young human race. In 2018, Kentucky has stated that they are leaning towards an abstinence-only school standard for school-age kids. Quote, Frankfort, Kentucky, Althurton High School senior Sophia Letson Eaton said she has no objections to abstinence and monogamy being part of public school sex education classes as called for in legislation pending in General Assembly. But much more is needed, including discussions about sexual abuse, consent, contraception, and healthy relationships, said Letson Eaton, speaking before a Senate committee Thursday concerning Senate Bill 71. Unquote. Quote, I hope you will join us in support of a comprehensive sex education program, said Letson Eaton, 18, who appeared with 3 other women to speak against the bill sponsored by Senate Stephen Meredith, a Litchfield Republican. Quote, so due to the young lady's bold statement, the school senate didn't change his mind on school teaching of abstinence bill, unquote, which was voted 7 out of 2. All 7 were white men, which supported the bill. The 2 African-American voted no, and they told them that the panel needs more information about what is being taught in the classroom. People and decision makers at the top may feel like they aren't setting a tone which may, quote, Kentucky is resulted from Republican State Senate Stephen Meredith, which requires sex ed classes to teach that, quote, abstinence from sexual activity from outside marriage is the expected standard for school-age children, unquote. Quote, Senate Danny Carroll, a Paducah Republican who voted for Bill 71, said he believes it's important to require that abstinence and monogamy be included in sex education, arguing that societies that don't set standards are doomed to fail. Unquote. Quote, as a society, if we don't set some baselines for our children, there are going to be no limits, he said. Senate Danny Carroll demonstrated a biased way of thinking instead of being open-minded. To change and new ways of thinking, he took a constricted approach. Why would our Senate control the content in which we learn from? Would it be smart to listen to someone that's in the school system that has concerns? Lack of knowledge can be detrimental to our health and mental standpoint. Quote, a majority of high school students already have had sex by their senior year, and many children have been subject to sexual abuse, said Cyril Choate, a Louisville sex educator who works for students. Lecturing them to abstain from sex does not provide the help or information they need, she said. Unquote. If these children are already being exposed to sexual contact, why shouldn't they be informed on all angles to know what to expect and how to behave? Senator Danny Carroll said he's setting a standard to try to stop the promotion of sex, but these young children can't control sexual abuse or rape. For those who want to offer their religious standpoint, they should reference to the scripture 4:6, quote, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge because you have rejected knowledge, unquote. It is vitally important that we are knowledgeable about every aspect of sexual content. Sexual learning content is crucial in young people's relationships, sexuality, and sexual behavior. Sexual behavior is natural in life, and it takes place every day, whether we talk about it or not. Sex is part of being human and a way of continuous life. The decisions that these children make will affect their life and well-being for the rest of their life. 750,000 teens become pregnant each year. Decrease this number by just providing knowledge. Quote, young people ages 15 to 24 account for 25% of all new HIV infections in the U.S. and make up almost one half of the over 19 million new STD infections Americans acquire each year. Sex educator, teacher, young people, the skills that they need to protect themselves, unquote. With this staggering fact, with the right teaching content for all states, we could decrease this number by just providing knowledge. Tune into episode 6 where Olivia will talk about sex education in Kentucky, laws and legislation.
Hi again, everyone, and thank you for tuning in on this episode of Sex Education. Last week, Josh talked about sex education content and creators and how their decisions affect everyone in the state of Kentucky. And this time, we're going to be talking about Kentuckian legislation. Is sex education regulated? Is it only abstinence? Is it political or personal? We'll look into all of these things and more in the previous episodes, but let's start off with the specific laws and regulations. In Kentucky, to keep it the way it is with sex education. The answer, there isn't any. There is no current law or legislation that outlines what needs to be taught or if sex education even needs to be taught in public schools. This can come as quite a shock considering how vital sex is to the human race. I mean, it's literally the most common thing on the planet. Despite sex education teachings being mandatory, Kentucky does regulate other parts of sex within state borders. Some might even say these laws directly coincide with what those ideas and topics might be covered with in normal sex education classes. But before we do that, let's look into why Kentucky has not yet made any legislation for sex education. The simple answer is they don't feel that they need it. And this is because they think that people who engage in sex in Kentucky are, quote, between a married man and woman in a Christian home, unquote. This is from a Kentucky senator, and not that that's to say that people haven't fought for better regulation. In 2018, Josh talked about the Athearn High School senior Sophia Leston, who stood before a Congressional General Assembly and testified that she has no objection to abstinence and monogamy being part of public school sex education classes, but it needs better sex education in general, and those can't be the only things that ever get taught. Luston lost the vote 2-7, with a panel that consisted of 5 white male judges between the ages of 45 and 60 and 2 African American judges. The panel reasoning for not allowing the vote to pass is abstinence from sexuality outside of marriage is the expected standard for school-age children. One of the panel voters said state law currently has no requirements for sex education, and Meredith, the bill's sponsor, schools that do offer sex education generally do so in health classes. The State Department of Education is working on guidelines for such classes. A representative from the State Department has told the committee this. He said that he thinks it's important to spell out in state law that abstinence and monogamy be included in such classes because abstinence, in fact, is the only measure which is 100% effective in preventing unwanted pregnancies and STDs. Reverend Lauren Jones Mayfield, a pastor at Highland Baptist Church in Louisville, said the bill's language doesn't address the reality of society where people are different faiths and sexual orientation and have different views about sex outside of marriage. These efforts have not completely been stopped, and more of the younger generation are looking to improve sex education in Kentucky. But what has Kentucky done as a state to try and make up for this lack of education regulation and outline the conducts of sex within the state? Again, most of these topics are covered in basic sex education courses, but because no formal outline exists, it's important to note that these laws have been set in stone for some time now. The state of Kentucky actively regulates the age of consent and the age of minority. Legally, people can't consent or agree to sex with someone who is considered an adult until they reach a specific age. This is called the age of consent. These laws are meant to protect minors from being manipulated or forced into sex with older people. In Kentucky, you can legally consent to sex when you become 16 years old. The age of minority, the age when someone is no longer considered a minor in Kentucky, as in most states, is 18. Therefore, you are legally considered an adult at age 18. Keep in mind that these laws may be different for you if you're legally considered an emancipated minor, are pregnant or married minor, or if you're in jail. Being a minor affects your right to have information and services. Services like contraceptives, medications, abortions, disease testing, and LGBTQ services. These services are not required to be offered by the state of Kentucky, but many private clinics like Planned Parenthood and others offer many of these services to fit the needs of those in Kentucky who cannot get proper help from the state. Despite them not being required services, they are regulated and are offered occasionally. If you're under 18 years old and you want an abortion, one parent must give permission before you can get one. This is called parental consent. If it's not possible and you are likely to ask a judge for permission or get special permission if it's an emergency, that's called judicial bypass. There's a 24-hour mandatory waiting period in Kentucky for someone to get an abortion. Kentucky requires in-person counseling prior to someone receiving the abortion, so more than one trip to the provider is necessary. All minors are allowed to get prescription birth control without parents' permission. However, a doctor may, but is not required, to inform your parents or guardians. The clinics call this Title X clinics, pronounced Title X, provide confidential sexual and reproductive health care to both teens and adults. The Title X clinics offer many services, including prescriptions for the pill, pregnancy option counseling, and testing for pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases and infections, including HIV. People of any age, including teens, can buy condoms from a drugstore, pharmacy, grocery store, or even online. A pack of 12 condoms costs about $12 if you're in Kentucky. Internal or female condoms are about $2 to $4 per condom. In Kentucky, minors, those under 18, don't need permission from your parents or guardians to get tested for STDs and HIV or to consent to treatment. However, healthcare providers may, but again, aren't required to inform your parents that you may receive certain healthcare services. Public schools in Kentucky have no safe school laws in effect, which is a statewide anti-harassment or non-discrimination law that includes the categories of sexual orientation and gender identity. There is no statewide anti-bullying laws to protect students based on sexual orientation or gender identity. Hate crime laws in Kentucky protect people on the basis of sexual orientation, but not gender identity. All in all, Kentucky is pretty unregulated when it comes to sex education because of one law, the Gateway Law. The Gateway Law says that schools' safe sex education programs should focus on abstinence-only education in order to encourage risk avoidance. The law regulates what can and cannot be said in sex education courses in school. It tells teachers that some things are considered a gateway to sexual activity, including that of hand-holding and hugging. The law severely limits what can be taught in schools as a form of sex education. The lack of regulation has gotten to Kentucky in some trouble by having the highest teen birth rates and top 10 all in STD stats. But join us on our final conclusion episode of real-life effects in sex education or lack thereof.
Welcome back, everyone. We are in the concluding episode of the Sex Education series. Today, everyone is on air, ready to discuss their final thoughts and opinions on their research. That being said, let's get started. So, in my opinion, I think schools should be promoting sex education. They should also be implementing better sex ed because that helps protect students. This also helps students make more logical choices and understand the consequences that they are enduring when they choose to have sexual intercourse with another partner. That being said, we will now turn it over to Devontae.
Okay, as far as my concluding thoughts, I believe that parents should definitely be for their kids learning more about sexual education. It makes sense as to why they would want to only teach abstinence, but it's also illogical to think that every kid will actually follow that. And also because of this, kids are also being raped within our society, and there are more pedophiles walking around the streets. It is important that we inform them of these potential predators so they'll have some idea of what to protect themselves against. What do you think about this, Liz?
I think that teachers have a lot of room to teach good information without breaking the laws, and sex education is so vital to students. And schools are supposed to be institutions for learning, and they should teach sex accurately. Teachers need better training for sex education, and they need to be more comfortable talking about difficult topics because students need a safe place for students to ask questions, and teachers need to be the ones to provide answers. So now Josh is going to be talking about his stakeholder.
Okay. I've concluded that we should be providing our students with comprehensive sex education teaching content because it will help with our decision making and how to take responsibility in our actions. Abstinence is a narrow topic and doesn't relate to the students that are sexually active. Why should we only teach abstinence when some kids are being sexually abused or raped? Abstinence is ineffective and only causes more problems. Religion and tradition is the only one perspective as it relates to the broad topic of sex education. In order to be well prepared for this world, we must give our children the wisest material to get through hardships and have a healthy sexual relationship. And now we'll turn it on to Olivia.
Thanks, Josh. So I talked about legislation in the current administration, and obviously it's not working because all the stats show that not teaching sex education doesn't actually stop kids from having sex. It's going to happen anyway, and so it's better to teach it safely and have real rules and regulations that could be useful to kids and teachers. Like I said, it's better to set those regulations and provide a mandatory knowledge of sex and what comes with it, as well as contraceptives and how to recognize abuse so they can seek help for those problems. We need to better prepare the next generation by teaching them everything that they need to know and giving them the ability to make well-informed decisions and have a good life. Thanks everybody for tuning in to Sex Education.